Well, hello, and thank you for joining us once more again in the Map Room for what is now the final episode of our third season. Pretty incredible we've got this far. When Paul and I started this now more than 3 years ago, we said, let's do 3 episodes. All the data that we saw said the average new podcast has a life of 3 episodes. So he said, let's do 3 and let's see where it goes. So some 38 episodes later, I can only say thank you to everybody who supported us, everybody who's listened and followed the show, and some of the great feedback we get. We know we're putting some value into your life as a small business owner, and specifically in the space we represent, agency owner. So as we get to this last episode now of this season, we are touching the end of 2025 and coming into the Christmas break and the Christmas season. And for me, over my career, it's always been a point of reflection. I often sit there, sometimes overstuffed with brandy and mince pies or whatever it is we have, and I like to reflect, and I'm one for setting sort of goals and ambitions for the year ahead. So my question today to everyone is 2026 the year when I either look potentially to sell my business, and we'll explain why you probably can't do it in 12 months. But more importantly, is it the time when I start to plan this or maybe even just think about it? Now, I had some data recently, which is really interesting from Capital on Tap, that said 79% of small business owners do not have any form of exit plan in place, but 10% would like to see an exit in 3 years. And so I wondered what the obstacles were to that. And what the data said was there was 3 clear top runners in terms of obstacles. 1 was difficulty in valuing the business. 2 was actually finding the right buyer. And the third, which we want to delve into today, was that of legal complexities. Now, going back exactly 3 years ago, December 2022, we spoke about the terrors of due diligence in the Map Room. And it's an area we'd like to maybe return to today. So I'm delighted to say that joining us today as our subject matter expert is Leanne Consiglio. And Leanne is a director and joint head of corporate at Hybrid Legal, somebody who we have spoken to and has worked with us previously, and I hope will be of great value to anybody listening today. So Leanne, welcome into the Map Room. Thank you so much for giving your time today, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Stuart. Well, thanks for having me on. And hopefully I can also add some value to your clients who are thinking about a sale process and are probably quite scared, daunted about the whole due diligence process.
I think it's the one area that everybody who goes through it says it's been the most stressful, and I don't know a small business owner who was really fully prepared for it. So what I'd like to do today is talk about the steps that maybe somebody could take in this coming year to get themselves ready, whether that's mentally ready, whether that's organizational ready, whether that's structure ready. And for that, I'd like to come back to one of my favorite subjects that I'm biased about, Leanne, and we'll probably explain why later, and that's that of a data room. So my first question to you is, in your experience, in your view, what is a data room and what's its primary function?
Well, the data room is like a verification process that a buyer will go through to make sure that the operations of the business match up to the financial offer that's been made. So your financials have hit the mark. You've received this fantastic offer that you're happy with, and you're going kind of gung-ho into a sale. You have to then prove that the way that you've run the business over the preceding years match up to those financials, because it's not only the financials that sell a business, as you'll know. And so the data room and the due diligence process is effectively verifying those operations. If operations haven't been carried out particularly well, then, this is the buyer's opportunity to go back and revisit what they've negotiated with you in the heads of terms. So you might see things like a price chip, you might see things like retention, so holding some money back from the purchase price, or even specific indemnities that the buyer might ask for if there are particular areas of risk that have been identified. So it's the lifting up the bonnet and having a good look around to make sure that everything is in order.
I think you've said a few things there which are worth probably clarifying further. You've said there that, so in terms of the process, this would normally only raise its head after there's been some kind of initial interest, potentially a heads of terms, as you say, some kind of offer that's been accepted, and then this data room gets dropped in. And it's one of the areas which, in my experience, all too often, sadly, I'm going to say, the professional buyer uses it as a discounting tool, as you said. Either be that a chipping exercise to get the price down, be that some kind of warranties, indemnities, which, again, we can talk about probably later. But again, in my experience, warranties, indemnities, whichever which way, even if it's in the formation of them, cost you money. And very often it's because that scale of information is just too much. So I'm really interested in when you said the years prior, and we all know that buyer wants to look at, will use a benchmark of, say, 36 months management accounts prior to a transaction. But it's interesting that for me that the data room therefore should be covering that history and not just the moment in time somebody comes knocking. So I suppose the follow-up question to what you've said there is, should I have to wait until I want to sell to look at investing in a data room?
Definitely not. I mean, preparation, early preparation is really key here to not only running your business from a really sensible risk perspective, but also ensuring that you've got as smooth as possible process when it comes to sell. You said something quite interesting actually at the start of the podcast about businesses finding this process particularly stressful and hard work. It would be interesting to ask those businesses whether or not they started their due diligence process early, or whether they were a business that just started to think about due diligence at the point that the offer was on the table. Because if you start to think about your due diligence process early on, and you set up your own internal data room, then that focuses your mind and gives you one eye on the kind of key areas of your business that really add value. And you can make sure that you're making informed decisions about how you are progressing in those areas and making sure that you're getting things right in those areas. Early preparation is really key there.
I think in answer to your question, Leanne, is that the reason that most people find it so difficult is absolutely what you said. They have waited until this point in the process. They have thought about this. In some cases, they've done a market investigation. They've done some kind of Project X is a UX design agency in the north of England, turnover X, Y, and Z. And then only after they've got some initial offers, and due diligence works both ways, do they then proceed to this? And as you say, very often after heads have been agreed. But it suddenly is that, where do I then look? I'm a big believer in lots of businesses, and we've had friends of ours on the podcast before who've spoken about, building a business to sell it. And lots of people look at their presence in the world and they'll look at what the outside world sees. They'll be bothered about their website. They'll be bothered about their logos. They'll be bothered about their PR, their catering, etc., etc. And yet for me, this is one of the most important things that tells the story of your business that people just simply seem to ignore until they need to get one. And then the panic is all there. So I think timing, as you said, is really key. I believe it's something you should have in your own arsenal anyway. And the reason I say that is probably moving on to my next point is this concept of the seller's agenda versus the buyer's agenda. So I often see too often, sadly, a templated questionnaire comes in, and you have to spend a lot of time looking at that and saying, okay, well, that's not appropriate for this business or whatever. Because in most of the transactions we get involved in, Leanne, it's the bigger business buying the smaller business. So the bigger business is probably experienced in this. I talk about the concept of professional buyer versus an amateur buyer. But it's the buyer wanting to say, okay, as you said earlier, I've made this indicative offer, but to sort of standardize that now, or to cement that in my mind, I want to check all these areas. And I try and liken it a little bit to the structural survey. You've just told me that you've
Yes.
invested in a new property, a big renovation job, which is probably had a structural survey that frightened the life out of everybody.
Yes, indeed.
But the point is exactly that. We all understand this process. We make an offer on a property that gets accepted. There's a structural survey or lawyers come in and things often change. So it's a bit like that. Now, I try and explain this story to people that if you go to sell your house, I spend quite a bit of my time in France. If you go to sell a property in France, and I understand it's the same in Scotland, by the way, let's bring it close to shore before people think it doesn't relate to us in the UK. You have to create a seller's document and a seller's pack that has lots of information in. So the seller invests in providing this information, and that is recommended, therefore, and it makes the process a lot easier. So I see it a little bit like that. It's like saying, look, if you were going to sell your property, wouldn't you want to show it in the best light? And I often see the same with this really in the data room. So let me come back to that concept of seller's agenda and buyer's agenda. What's your view on the difference for that? What examples have you seen where it drives a wedge potentially? And what should the seller look out for on a buyer's agenda?
Well, if we look at the seller's agenda first, because we've kind of already touched on what the buyer's agenda is going to be. So the seller's agenda, I always think, use this as your opportunity to make a fantastic first impression, to show the buyer how organized you are and how well and prudently you have managed the business. This is your first impression. If you have got a fantastic data room with all of your documents and you're able to answer all of the questions thoroughly because you've had one eye on it for the past however many years, then that's a great first impression to make. And that then translates into the deal itself, because what the buyer's advisors will be telling the buyer is, this is a really organized company. Can't really find any skeletons in the closet here. And therefore, when you're in a process of negotiation, that buyer, even if it is a much bigger buyer, is going to take you more seriously than the company that turns up and is completely disorganized or just doesn't have the answers and is kind of scrabbling around. That doesn't create a good first impression. So it not only helps the process move along more swiftly, but I think it gives you much better bargaining power as well, because it shows that you take business seriously and you'll want to be somebody that the buyer wants to work with. The other thing that can happen if you're the opposite and you're not organized is you'll get the first due diligence questionnaire of 200 questions and you'll be totally exhausted after you've tried to answer all of those because you don't know where the information is, or you haven't got it, or it's out of date. And then you'll get the next 50 questions because your first 200 weren't good enough. And then the next 20 after the 50, and it kind of goes on like that. And what can happen is that you can get deal fatigue before you've even really started on the sale and purchase agreement. And I see it so many times where sellers are just kind of tired out and they start to concede on silly points just because they don't have the energy, because they've spent so much energy on the due diligence process. So use the preceding time, use that period when you start to think about a sale, not when you're getting the heads of terms in, to really practice, and put into place good procedures, and that will help you overall.
I think there's a number of things there that are really important to sort of look back on, because this all comes down to the value. I think there is the point that says, first of all, it is about showing the buyer confidence, as you said, and the fact that you do understand your business and what you're talking about. And I often ask people, if you look at some of the social media clips of the Dragon's Den, they're always the catastrophes. They're never the success story. And they're the one where somebody can't answer a question and it starts to fall. And as soon as one dragon's out, as you've just said, the next dragon comes in with, well, if you couldn't answer that, what about this? And I've seen this. I've seen it in my own previous transactions that I did, where it is that sort of fatigue. And it can work both ways. It can be Because if you haven't decided what you think's important and got that ready to show, so let's go back to the sales brochure. You wouldn't sell your house by saying to an estate agent, don't worry about measuring any rooms, don't worry about taking any photographs, just put a postcode and a price up and we'll see where we go. It just wouldn't happen. And yet people seem to think that's what they do their business. So decide the parts of the business that you want to show you understand. You mentioned there about the buyer wanting to work with you, and I think there's two really important things there. One is the buyer wanting to work with you to get the transaction done, because if both parties are committed to the transaction, it is, in my experience, more likely to happen. The fatigue comes in, and as you say, either the buyer or the seller, and it doesn't matter in this instance, gets to a point where they either go, or just give up. And I've seen that
Yeah.
happen. And I will agree to those warranties and indemnities, or do you know what? I'm just walking away. But the other one that happens a lot in this sector we represent is that of earnouts and deferred and conditional payments. And I don't know of many. Some of our clients have been public about it, including on the podcast. Some have been private about it, where the earnout was not as they anticipated and it didn't work out quite as swimmingly as they thought it would. And it comes back to, I'm a big believer in one of the reasons very often in a small business the acquirer wants the principal to stay involved is so they have that information. What happens if we have a problem in 3 months, 6 months, 9 months' time? Oh, Stuart will understand where that is.
Yeah.
I was very fortunate in 2 transactions not to have any involvement post-transaction, because we displayed a data room and we displayed a business that could function without the principals. And that for me is where you gain the most value. So I think
Yes.
that's another really important part about the data room, is deciding whether, are you wanting to be involved in that business going forward? Are you wanting to exit? And I often say exit is not binary for that reason. An exit often is not, your life can change post-transaction and you're not exited at all. But if you wish to exit, you need to demonstrate you've built a business that is operationally sound, financially sound, structured sound, processes are there. And the best way to demonstrate that, and as I say, it's the best sales brochure you'll ever have, is a professional data room.
Absolutely. I mean, some of the most kind of successful transactions I've seen, particularly successful earn-out periods, reflect exactly what you've just said, where the owner managers have set the business up, in such an organized way that it works really well without them. So they've managed to get a much shorter period in terms of the earn-out, in terms of them being there because they're confident that they're going to hit the targets that need to be hit, and are able to walk away. If they're not, then that kind of disorganization and constantly feeling like somebody's breathing down your neck and asking you questions is going to continue for as long as that earn-out is in place. And you'll know there's not many transactions without some kind of future earn-out or deferred
Yeah.
consideration.
Yeah. And again, and let's just talk about that. Technically, though, obviously deferred consideration is very often a percentage of valuation paid on completion and then subsequent payments. But again, we often see, and it's becoming more and more prevalent now, is that they are conditional. They're not just deferred to say payment 2 will receive on the anniversary of this business, which I have done previously. But they're conditional on certain issues. And what you have to remember is, for everybody or anybody listening, is that I know of people who think they've tricked the buyer. They've put some information, they've cobbled together these answers, they think they've been clever, they think they've been economic with the truth. Let's use that one. And guess what? 6 months in, 9 months in, the new finance team or the new operations manager starts to ask questions. One of the reasons people put those conditional payments in is because it's all about, okay, if I believed you then, is what you're telling me solid later? And again,
Yes.
the way to build that confidence is to have less of those issues of doubt or grey areas. Let's just use that phrase, grey areas that people would look to see, really.
Of course. And every transaction that you're working on where you've got a deferred element, if the lawyers are corporate lawyers and are used to doing this kind of work, then there'll always be a set off provision against your deferred consideration in respect of warranty claims. So, if something that you haven't told them about, or the example that you gave, they think they've tricked the buyer, if that comes to light, there's then the ability for the buyer to effectively hold back some money from the deferred consideration until that issue has been resolved. Now, resolving an issue often means litigation. Litigation means
Yes.
time, lots of time and money. So if you were planning on getting your cash for your retirement plans or whatever else it is that you're going to do, then that might kind of scupper your retirement plans because you're not getting the money when you were expecting to receive it.
You've just made me remember something that actually happened in a transaction I had there, Leanne. This is, for me, the reason I'm biased about having your own data room, because it allows you to control the narrative to a point. If you wait for all the questions from the buyer and only answer those questions, and I've met people who think that's the right way of doing it, what happens if something comes up later that wasn't considered at the time? So I I invested in a business that had some problems previously that I wasn't fully aware of, but I think I understood. And as we unearthed issues, we kept a H1T bucket to say we're keeping all of that there. So if anyone asks us, we're hiding absolutely nothing. And in
Yeah.
fact, we decided at the point of selling that business, it was good advice from an AIM listed acquirer came knocking, was looking at that business and said, look, these are some issues for us, but my advice to you would be get them front and center going forward. So it comes back to that point of having everything. And then rather than the view that says, I've only answered the questions I've been asked, is do you have a view on that? Have your problems, have your histories, have your success stories, but also have your historical issues clearly documented. Do you have an opinion on that?
Absolutely. I mean, confessional, what I like to call it, your
That's a better
disclosure,
description than mine, Leanne. I'll give you that one.
you
A
know,
far better, far more, a far more pleasant description than mine.
disclosure process, your confessional is effectively what can get you off the hook from a claim in the future. If you are telling your buyer about problems so that they are aware of those problems and they go into the transaction being aware of those problems formally as part of the contract process, then potentially, unless the buyer has negotiated with you for some protection, you're off the hook as far as those issues are concerned. So it's better, I think, to say as much as you can, then keep things to yourself, particularly as well. So another kind of technicality in the legal documents is there will be limitations and things that will protect the seller, or which will attempt to protect the seller in the event of a breach of warranty claim. Those limitations generally don't apply if things have been concealed.
Exactly.
So, the lawyer's advice is always be honest, be upfront, because it's better to know and to go into the deal with your eyes open than to keep things in and hope for the best.
A lot of that, though, that comes back to this risk of leaving it until the last minute. That's a lot of that comes from, and you're reliant there, aren't you, on your advisor and the legal advisor to say, hang on a minute, this is an issue. There is the old ignorance is not a defense. So I know of people who have genuinely, honestly answered all the questions given to them. And because the buyer didn't ask specific questions in certain areas, left them, thought they don't matter. And they absolutely came back. In this particular instance I'm thinking of, it was 6 years later, which is outside of a lot of
Mm.
warranties and indemnities, but it was a long time later. There was an issue came up that led this person to get dragged in again. And it was to do with some HMRC issues and some penalty notices and et cetera, et cetera. But it became apparent because it was a much larger business buying them. And so reputation, all that came in. But this comes back to, I think we're all guilty, aren't we, of if we have a problem, we sort of solve it and move on. We're actually recording that and keeping it there and keeping it in that data room. And it could be that. It could be as basic as we often see questions, don't we, about things such as change of ownership clauses in contracts, all things like that, which people go, oh, I don't think I've ever had that, rather than taking the time to making sure that,
Yes.
okay, whilst you celebrate that big win, have you stored a copy of that master service agreement, contract, whatever phrase we want to use, in your data room. Because if you haven't, are you going to be able to find that document 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years later? And I'm a big believer in using it as, I call it a reference library. A friend of mine used to call it a scrapbook. I quite like that phrase, which was, I
Yeah.
put all my clippings in there, good and bad, because I never know when it might come out. I'd like to ask a question slightly different, because we spoke there about the importance of the data room if you are fortunate enough to get a transaction. What happens if either that transaction stalls? We've said about deal fatigue, and I think deal fatigue is something which you will see more than most.
Mhm.
Most small business owners don't recognize that until it happens to them. They don't understand it. But if the transaction stalls, or I like to say to lots of people, you don't have to say yes. Our job is to help you get these options and get offers on the table, but you don't, even if you've gone down the route of accepting an offer, you don't have to say yes. You can say no at any time. Where does the data room stand at that point? How do you leverage that data room if the transaction stalls or if you change your mind?
Well, you can, depending on where you go from there in terms of the sale process, if you're still looking to actively sell, that data room can be used in the future in a potential sale as the starting point.
If it
No,
is
sure.
your data room,
Mhm,
you own that data. If a data room has been collated by, so Leanne is acting as the advisor for the buyer,
mhm.
and Hybrid Legal have sent through their data room template, and we'll talk about your processes maybe a little later. But if you've controlled that data room, is that data room still open and free to the seller at that point, or is it the buyer's data room?
No, that is still for the seller, and the intellectual property in that doesn't pass to the buyer. And of course, any heads of terms and confidentiality agreement will effectively navigate that. So that information can then be used by the sellers going forward, to speed up any future process so that you're not, as I said before, starting again.
And this comes back to, I suppose, and we can talk a little bit about where tech comes into this. Again, for me, it's about control. I would want to use a process and a template which I understood and I therefore owned at that point. Uh, yep, accepting that very often, and I've had this, by the way, in a recent opportunity there was essentially two data rooms going. There was the formal data room being managed by the buyer's legal representatives, but there was also a links to an existing data room that existed for the seller for that reason, to say, well, here's the links to this, here's links to that. Because I have seen it in the past where using, as would have been maybe an Excel or, God forbid, some kind of written document exchange, that actually some of that data goes missing because when the
Yeah,
buyer pulls back, they stop sharing data, they stop sharing permissions, etc. So I do think that's whilst it's important for people to understand that, as you say, it's your information, it's your IP, it's how readily can you get your hands on that if
yes.
you wanted to. And I do think that's a value in having your own, really.
Absolutely. I mean, tech is fantastic now, in terms of virtual data rooms and allowing clients to be much more organized with their information. We typically have a kind of two-stage process where we will have an area within our client management system that our clients, the sellers, can access, plus other members of the seller's team, so everybody can be working collaboratively within an area to make sure that all of the questions are being answered and all of the documents are being collected. And then once that process is complete, that secure area can then be shared with the buyer and the buyer's advisors. So you know where everything is, you know who's got access to it. The technology now tells you when things have been changed, who's
Yeah,
had a look at
audits.
something. It indexes everything for you. So it's really fantastic in terms of where we are now, compared to where we were when I was a trainee 20 years ago, when we used to get a suitcase
Yeah.
of paperwork or a crisp box, with just God knows what you would find in there, and you would spend weekends, trying to sift through it all, figure out what document related to which question. Now you can set your data room up, you can set folders up related to particular questions, particular areas, and everybody can work collaboratively. And it's really great from an organization and risk management point of view.
I think the word collaboration is a really interesting one as well there, Leanne, in that one of the questions we get asked a lot of many, many times is, do we have a view on involving the team, be that senior management team, be that employees, when very often the shareholders are negotiating a sale? I have mixed views on it, and I've changed my
Yeah.
mind over the time. There's the view that says, well, be careful saying too much, because we know that in the space we represent, less than 5% of transactions complete. So be careful what you promise, and potentially disappoint the staff, and also potentially frighten the staff. But one of the real benefits I've seen of creating your own data room is actually, and we had this, by the way, before I sold this particular agency. It came from a client asking us to complete what ostensibly was due diligence, but it was for information security,
Hmm.
infosec purposes. Can we see examples of this? Can we see all your GDPR compliant contracts of employment, etc., etc.? But it made us realize that trying to find that information was difficult, let alone the pressure of trying to manage the transaction. And we found it easier, therefore, to give the relevant member of the team access to, as you say, that part of it, to say, look, we just need to make sure that these contract employments GDPR compliant, etc., etc. And it allowed us to collaborate easier, because it wasn't the secret squirrel, there's a deal going on, but we can't tell you about it.
Yes.
Very often people either misunderstand or get too deep into NDAs. I've signed an NDA. I can't share it with my wife. Will tell you. First time I did sold my first business, I think she thought I was having some kind of affair or relationship, because I was having all these late night secret meetings and
Yeah.
secret phone calls out of the office for that reason. But nowadays, as you say, with the technology available, you can collaborate with your team. You can, with all honesty, explain to them you are building your own data vault just to make sure everything's there for compliance and governance. We'll talk about in a second. And then, as you say, you can control that later. Maybe let's jump onto that one then. So in terms of added benefits, we said about where we can leverage it. And the obvious leverages are, once you have it, you've got it, it's there, you can use it again. It might not all be appropriate, but the majority of the data would be appropriate for an alternative transaction, perhaps. But what in terms about just governance, good governance? So using a data room to not even maybe demonstrate good governance, just put the process of good and appropriate governance for you as a director of that business.
Well, yeah, I mean, having a data room, I think, is not only relevant for if you're selling, it's helping you run that business in an efficient way. We see so many clients who spend time and money taking legal advice and who don't necessarily finish things, who ask us to help them with a client contract, ask us to help them with an employment contract, get that all lovely, finished, perfect, and ready to sign, and never actually get it signed. If you've got a data room that's focusing your mind on putting things in there and organizing them as they're done, you're not going to sleepwalk into silly mistakes like that. A lot of clients see due diligence as this big, scary process, and it can be, because it's cumbersome and it's hard because you're trying to keep things confidential. But if you're organized, it takes so much of that away. Most of the stuff that we come across in terms of due diligence and problems is silly mistakes, like, not having things signed. If you're using that tool day to day and you're updating it as you go along, you're much less likely to fall into those traps. I have a terrible horror story with a client who was looking to sell, and um, there was a couple of the senior management team that were aware of this. They were told about this process. And then they effectively said that they were going to hold the business to ransom. saying the client should sell the business to them for a much knocked down price. And if they didn't, they were going to leave and take all of the clients with them. Now clients said, well, of course they can't do that. We've got employment contracts. We've got restrictive covenants. Yes, they did have restrictive covenants, but their employment contracts weren't signed. So that you can imagine, you think you are
Yeah.
starting a sale process, and then you've got two senior team leaders who are holding you to ransom. And on the face of things, there's nothing that you can do about it because the restrictive covenants aren't in place. Those things won't be missed. They shouldn't be missed if you're keeping an eye on things regularly.
I think it comes back, doesn't it, to actually getting everyone to understand what due diligence actually means. It is the due process you should be following as the business owner and or a director of that business. And I respect that very often we talk about lots of our clients wearing both hats. They are a shareholder and a director.
Yes.
So without going into the different duties of directors and shareholders, but the common sort of governance is a phrase I often use. And people think governance is some kind of, draconian problem. And I'm saying, but it's just you making sure, not only covering yourself, making sure things are done properly. And that due diligence process is exactly that. And because of this particular client wanted this info set review every January, that forced us to do that exercise every year. Exactly that. Have we got this up to date? And one of the classic ones we found was where we had promoted somebody in the business and their contract of employment was still the project manager when they joined 5 years prior or whatever it was. So due diligence works both ways, and it's about using it for your own benefit and for your
Yes.
own governance, really, to make sure you are doing things the right way.
Spotting issues early and giving you the time to sort out those issues yourself rather than finding out about those issues by somebody else's professional advisor and then effectively being dictated to about how that issue needs to be resolved for the purposes of a sale.
And sometimes, well, Leanne, it's what you don't know. I often tell the story that in the first agency that I sold, and when we came to sell that business, it literally was at the circa 11th hour of the due diligence process. And this is where I hadn't at that point had done my own sort of data room, is that it was it was a NASDAQ listed buyer, and it was the statutory books, the statutory registers were not in the format the buyer was expecting to see. Now, at no point had I thought this business was up and running a long time before I got involved. At no point did I sit there and go, hang on a minute, let me just go and check that register of members. Let me go and check this. And that's something, ironically, we do now with Matt. We offer that we will, check and manage your
Yes.
statutory records for you, because that nearly cost us that deal at the last minute. The US buyer, having gone through everything, every operational element of DD, said, excuse me, but these records are not in the format we thought they should be. And
Yes.
that's another area that I say, even if it's only for yourself, make sure you do it. We have it so many times, Leanne, where in lots of the businesses we represent, there'll be a group of people who started the business. And through that time, 1, 2 or more of those founders have left, moved on, done something different. And actually making sure the share transfers are there, the
Yes.
contracts there, everything's there is in your own benefits. And you should have that anyway, even if you've decided is the last person standing to say, I'm running this as a lifestyle business. The benefit of that data room is it allows you to ensure that you are unearthing potential problems. It's what you don't know comes back to bite you, particularly when you say you're under pressure, really.
Absolutely. I mean, you give the example of previous founders, previous shareholders. We've seen ex-husbands,
Yeah.
ex-wives still holding shares at the point of a sale, which is definitely not where you want to be. Or
Yeah.
we've even had, a corporate shareholder that had never transferred shares
Yeah.
and which
Seen
had
that.
been so those shares were then held by the Crown. That completely derailed that deal because that all had to be rectified. Again, small things, small things that you can sleepwalk into if you're not thinking about them, that can cause a real problem at the point of sale, which if you just manage year in, year out, will give you much, much better peace of mind.
In terms of managing the process, or maybe getting the process down to not this last minute panic, um, I know that you have a process called Align 9. Help
Yes.
people understand, what is that? And first of all, in terms of what is the process, and talk through the stages. Do people have to start at a level, or can they come in at certain different levels to get these services?
So a line 9 is effectively our attempt to reduce a 200-page due diligence questionnaire into a one-page document that summarizes the 9 key areas that most buyers are going to look at when they are acquiring a company. And then the starting point from that one pager is to identify which of those areas have the most value within that business, within your business, so that we can then move on to a kind of red, amber, green health check report where we look at the key areas and we identify, are you up to date? Are you compliant? Do you have these things? And if you don't, setting out a plan as to what you need to do in order to get yourself into shape. So it is proactivity, basically. It's designed to make clients proactive in thinking about how they're running their business if they want to sell in the future, and to concentrate the mind onto the key areas of value within the organization. And then we help implement a plan to make sure that those areas are well protected, well documented. So yeah, if people start that process early, obviously that makes it much easier to implement, because you might do it over a period of a year, 2 years. You know, people don't always have the budget to do everything immediately, which you might need to do if you're looking to sell. So yes, it's an attempt to concentrate the mind and make sure that the key assets are protected.
You just said something there about the budget of it. And this comes back to, as you say, deal fatigue, and also sometimes just not extracting the maximum value. Is you're about to go through a renovation on a property. And if you sat there and said, okay, I'm going to renovate that property in the next 6 months, 12 months, whatever it is,
Mhm.
it's going to cost a lot of money, and you're not going to get maybe the value back immediately. But if you looked at it and said, okay, look, for me to get this to the place I want to live, but also so I can, offer the most value number of his time, that's something you're going to do over a longer period. And I bring that back again. You said there, this is about something which you can look at and go, do you know what? These are the key elements now. Because if it's a key value, I would
Mhm.
suggest it's also a key risk. If it's
Yes.
key value to you, how do we protect it? How do we make it better? How do we ring fence it? How do we stop it being shot at? But it's also that point that says, but do this as you go along. Because as you say, the time, and, you and I probably both know one of the biggest killers for deals is time. People
Yes.
believe they can get a deal done quickly, and a professional buyer or an active buyer will often put a timescale on it. I happened to sell to an American business, I said earlier, and they were in classic 13-week cycles. And it wasn't done in that 13 weeks, that quarter, it wasn't going to get done.
Mm.
And therefore, not having that information is crucial. So I think it's about, as you say, it's building that picture over a period of time. As you start to do your plans for renovation, it's how do you take that property I have today to a property that is going to be of absolute best value, might take you 10 years. I don't know what it's going to take you, but that's an important thing for people to consider. Give me an example of what kind of areas do you bring into that 9? Is it the logical people and contracts, commercial contracts? Just an example of the kind of areas that you
Absolutely.
want to look at.
I mean, agency land, we're obviously thinking about your client contracts. We're thinking about your intellectual property, and we're thinking about your team. So your client contracts, we want to make sure that there are no skeletons as far as your client contracts are concerned. Have you got capped liability if things go wrong? Do you know if your contracts include change of control clauses, which
Big one, that,
allow
Leanne.
your clients to terminate those contracts that you have agreed a value on, allow them to terminate in the event that the business is sold? You know, what about scope creep? What about suspending payments of invoices if they're not happy with the work. All of these things we would consider with the clients. It's not always the case that you have got free rein to say, yes, we've read your contract, we don't like it, and we're going to give you a complete markup. That's not always realistic, particularly with bigger clients. But going through the Align 9 process can help you identify some of the key points for your organization, like payment terms, for example. Clients think that they have a dream contract, and then obviously the payment terms, along with the ability for the client to suspend payment if they're not happy with the work and to keep asking you for 17 million iterations of what it is you're doing from them, actually make that contract a complete loss leader. So it can help you identify commercially what's relevant for your organization to get the best value out of your clients. Your team, obviously I gave the illustration before about making sure that your team can't go away and take all of the value of the business. Obviously, we want to be able to step away, hopefully, from the client-facing side as business leaders to concentrate on strategy. So we need to make sure that the people who are in those roles are not going to walk away with that value. And there are those restrictive covenants in place. Might also generate conversations about who are the key people in this team? Do we need to get them on some kind of share plan, EMI scheme, to make them think about the growth of the business, increasing the value and participating in a sale? And of course, if those are already in place, have they been done correctly? Because that's another big area in due diligence where we see things which have gone horribly wrong because an EMI scheme hasn't been put in place. And then the employees aren't going to get what they thought they were going to get. That can be a really horrible situation on a sale. And of course, IP. If you've got IP that is being produced by a freelancer rather than an employee, then
very
unless
often in
you
this space, very often, isn't it that?
very often, if you haven't got contracts in place which make sure that that IP is assigned over to you, then you don't own the IP that you are purporting to transfer to your clients. And that's a big one, again, that comes up in due diligence, and very costly if you have to go to the freelancer at the point of sale and ask them for an IP assignment because suddenly they think, why is this
value,
happening
exactly.
now? Oh, this is,
I think IP in itself is a fascinating one. And we haven't got enough time. Maybe we should have another one on that, which is I often talk with people and they think that the IP is what they've built. So classic agency, design and build, design something, build a website, deliver it. Let's just use e-commerce, for example, deliver it. And therefore they'll argue the IP exists in what they've given and say, well, we'll have to look at commercial contracts to see whether at point of payment does the IP transfer. That's a separate issue. But I think, particularly in the agency space, lots of people will say, oh, they don't have IP, don't build something. And notwithstanding their process, the way in which we do something, the way in which we qualify an opportunity, the way in which we quote a proposal, the way in which we onboard a client, all of that is knowledge and IP that's been built by that business. And as you say, I hear lots of people who believe they've got non-competes in, et cetera, and forgetting the fact that person, well, that's fine, but how do you safeguard the processes that person, the knowledge that person's learned and experienced whilst they're in your business? Because for me, your operating processes are your IP. The other reason why I'm a big fan of having processes documented and sat in that data room is so you can say, well, hang on a minute, that is ours. How can you say 2 years later or 6 months later, but we developed that design review process? Well, how did you? Where's it documented?
Yes.
Particularly now with AI and everything else, but that's a story for another day, really.
Yes.
I'm conscious of time because we always try to keep these to about an hour and we're getting close now. We call these things briefings when we started this series and every conversation goes on, but that's why I love them because they're meaningful conversations. The Align 9 piece I understand is a way in which, as you say, can be about if your plan is to sell, this is it. But I'm assuming it could also just be, look, this is how you can adopt some best practice. This is how you can make sure that your client contracts are right. This is how you can make sure your team contracts are right. Even if someone says, do you know what, Leanne, I can't, I'm starting this business. I don't think we'll ever sell this business, or that's 10 years away. I'm assuming that a process that says my view of a data room is get that best practice in. I'm assuming, therefore, a line 9 is not only specific to if you are seeking to sell the business.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's encouraging clients to spend their time more wisely, spend your time in your area of expertise, take advice on the legal issues, and once those have been resolved, you know, that allows you so much more time to be getting on with what you're good at and growing the value of the business. There's no point trying to, do it yourselves or figure it out. It just takes so much more time and you don't know whether you've got it right. So yeah, I would definitely recommend that. It's like us, when sometimes my co-directors come to me and ask me to give input on something creative. We need a deck. What do you think this looks like? Don't ask me.
Yeah.
Don't ask, I'll make a complete muck of it. Nobody will want to look at it and it won't show us in the best light. As somebody who knows what they're doing. And that's really, the purpose of a line 9, to encourage that.
Yeah, really, really valuable. If this has resonated, Leanne, if people understand that and say, do you know what, as we open at the top of this, next year is the year when I either look to sell my business or look to start that process, or it's somebody saying, that's interesting. I wonder if I could do a secret shopper exercise in my own business and ask somebody with a more experienced eye to look at my business and maybe point me under the bonnet, show me where my oil is leaking. How
Mhm.
does somebody find you, Leanne?
We are on LinkedIn, we are on Instagram, and we also have something called the Legal Loop that people can subscribe to, which gives kind of bi-weekly tips about the kinds of things that you should be keeping abreast of within your organization, typically geared around agency clients.
How do I find the Legal Loop, Leanne? That sounds like a really useful subscription that somebody should look at. How do I find that today?
Clients can access that on our website, hybridlegal.co.uk, where there'll be a link for you to subscribe.
Well, listen, I can only say thanks again so much for your time. It's been a really useful conversation. I know I'm biased about this, but having gone through it a number of times, I'm a big believer in preparing people the best it can be and avoiding that terror of due diligence that most people. I do believe it's a big reason why people often only sell once, Leanne. I think it
Yes.
puts people off. I know just how valuable it is. I know, having gone through it myself as a buyer and a seller, that it is difficult. I do worry about those people who don't understand it in advance, and I think it puts them off very often. A transaction, once bitten, twice shy, I think it puts people off obtaining the value that, as you say, might be their retirement plan, might be reward, etc. So thank you so much. As I said, this is the last one for this season 3, the last one for 2025. I hope it's been of use, and I hope we'll see you back in the map room again in 2026. Thanks, and bye for now.
Thank you, Stuart.